welcome to our show, What Now? We're joining you after quite a long pause, I would say. We were also taking a pause. I'm joining you from London, and this is, it's 27th of May today. So the world is sort of relaxing on lockdown. I have with me, joining with me is my co-host, John Hilbrey from Portugal, Sesimbra. And apparently the lockdown it's been lifted in Portugal. So John can briefly touch on that. And then we have our guest, Dr. Kenneth Silvestri, joining us from New York. So Dr. Ken, or Ken, as I would be calling him, is a certified classical homeopathic practitioner, a psychotherapist, certified forgiveness trainer as well, which is interesting. I would like Ken to maybe tell us about what does that mean about forgiveness training. How do you train people to forgive? And my interest basically is about systemic frameworks and system change as the whole world is sort of going through this shift. And we know the complexity of how to now create new systems, or the old systems coming back. Is there a room for a new system? And my particular interest or question to you would be about, it's always a chicken and egg situation with healing and also, transformation. Is it going to be just the individual? Is it going to be the organization or community, as we call it? Or how would the societal transformation come about? We start with the individual, but then the individual becomes part of a community which is maybe not that transformed. And it's always a chicken and egg situation. Where do we start? Would it work this time around? Or how do you see that? Is this an opportunity for all of us for a new start? So over to you, Ken, and then John, if you have a question or anything, feel free to just interrupt me. Thank you, and welcome to our show.
Well, thank you very much. It's an honor to be here, and that's a delightful framework that you just laid out. I'll actually challenge you on that chicken and egg, metaphor, because one of the things that I've been doing is to try to get away from anything, and I'm quite sure you didn't mean it in this way, but anything that's really linear, like there's a cause and effect. Mm-hmm. I always think of how we have to collaborate rather than negotiate. Once we start doing that, we get out of what I call that kind of narrow perspective. Excuse me. My training is in anthropology and psychology. So I was very grateful and lucky to be able to study with some really wonderful anthropologists, Margaret Mead, Gregory Bateson, and Paul Byers. And so I was at Columbia when there still was what I call the real anthropologists, who really used all their senses. And so systems work is what I really am about. And just prior we were talking about how to integrate homeopathy or education and politics. Well, you have to have a framework, or as I say, an epistemology. We all have an epistemology, and the epistemology that deals with systems thinking is to look at the whole as more than the sum of the parts. My favorite quote, and I'll refer back to Gregory Bateson, who really influenced me, is that he always said that the problems in the world are the difference between how nature works and the way people think. Once we start looking at that, there's a gap between what we think and how the world works, and that could be a gap that causes so many problems. Nature is wonderful. Nature works with paradoxes and contradictions. Carl Jung always said that. Thank God for paradoxes. That's how we find ourselves. We have to work through these paradoxes and these contradictions. So nature is messy, and systems thinking is messy in many ways, but it's messy in a way that allows us to be vulnerable. A system, and the simple explanation is that's a collection of entities or persons or institutions that's so arranged that a change in one will affect a change in another. You know, it's like, you know, some people talk about, well, you have a thermostat and you have a, you know, you have a boiler and it works that way. But, you know, the big thing is systems is an open system, open process, and there's patterns that connect within this process. So we have an enormous amount of power and influence to be able to influence or adjust systems. You know, systems fall towards order. You mentioned before, there's a kind of an entropy that's going on because are we ever going to go back to whatever is normal? I don't even know what normal is, but we do have an opportunity to really look at the world in a different way and to see all the interactions that, you know, that occur in that. The Greeks, you know, had a, I still do, I have a word, Gaia, which is the, how they describe the earth, and the earth is more, you know, than the individual parts. It has its own entity, and that goes right down, you know, to who we are. And it is not only a leap of faith, but it is a gathering of our epistemology in order to be able to move, you know, forward. So do stop me, you know, and ask any questions. But you know, my point is that the difference, I think, as we go forward is that we have to look more at our interdependency. You know, that's a big thing in systems thinking, whether it be economics or education. You know, why not bring these old things back together? You know, when I worked, I actually started out as a teacher working in public schools in the New York, New Jersey metropolitan area. And I was immediately attracted to setting up alternative programs. And alternative programs was to get away from the you know, the 45-minute periods that they do here in the United States. We have math proficiencies, English, and so many other subjects, but very fragmented. And also there's a lot of disparaging and unequilibrium as far as tracking and what certain kids will fall behind. One of the things that I was able to do is to set up programs where not only do we have parents involved, but we had kids learning in transdisciplinary ways, you know, learning in the community. I would take the proficiency, the state required proficiency of, say, history, that they had to know certain things about the Constitution or whatnot, and actually take that proficiency and allow the young people to go into the community and create different contexts, different situations, and be able to still see the connection. So instead of just grading on, you know, one subject, we did interdependent, you know, lack of a better word, interactions. And this is how you brought different people together. You know, sometimes the science people weren't talking to the English people or the history people or whatnot. Oh. That's a microcosm of schools, but what about, you know, the whole community? Recently, I've been very influenced by my friend Nora Bateson, who is Gregory Bateson's daughter. I had the opportunity to go to Poland with her and several other people for a symposium a few years ago, I think it was 2 years ago, where we looked at how could systems thinking actually influence and make changes. You know, change comes about when we recognize anomalies. And there are a lot of anomalies. There's, again, unequal distribution. There's a lot of polarization, climate issues, and so many. You know, I also, as I say, I work, as you mentioned, I work as a therapist where I work a lot with families. And when I work with families, I try to open up the perspective to have people from different contexts within the community come together in order to be able to make changes. Because individual changes alone don't always, they get caught in that, you know, subject and predicate, you know, more linear kind of, you know, viewpoint. So in Poland, what was nice, it kind of reconstituted my love for looking at things systemically, to hear many other people talk about it. You know, one of the things that we talked about, something I've been playing with for many years, and I know Nora Bateson has done a lot of writing about this, and she's just an incredible, wonderful thinker, poet, systemic thinker who's really working on making changes. But we use the word liminal a lot. You know, liminal is an adjective that describes a transitional initial stage, you know, an interactive process. So when we're talking systems and change, we're really talking about moving to the edge of our paradigms of our thought process. And with liminal, it's nice because there's a pause. And when you're really thinking about nature and systems, you're really thinking about all the possibilities that are out there. And some could be good and some could be bad, and there's paradoxes. And if we don't resolve the paradoxes, we end up in double binds. We're in a double bind in many ways, dealing with the pandemic. And if we do an autopsy of how and where and why, you know, we could see that a lot of times some narrow thinking, Newtonian thinking, that is still behind a lot of science, but we're not in a, you know, an organized box. We are simultaneously part of so much at the same time. So one of the things that that Nora Bateson you know, has mentioned that always sticks with me, and it's kind of an evolution from what her father taught many years ago. When I was studying with Gregory Bateson, I still have the original book, The Ecology of Steps to an Ecology of Mind, and even though it's falling apart, I still keep it here because there's a lot of words of wisdom. And Nora's recent book, or actually a few years ago, is Small Arcs of Larger. Oh God, she'll kill me if I don't know the title, but it's a book that deals with systemic thinking, you know, moving forward in a probably more contemporary way. But she always says that, you know, that this whole process of systems thinking and change is something that cannot be found in individuals, rather is found between them. It cannot be found in organizations, nations, religions, or institutions, rather is found between them. And this is where that sense of, you know, the word is not the thing, but where when liminal just dissolves into a process, it becomes a sense of mutual learning. The book is Small Arcs of Larger Circles.
I would have to look into it.
Correct too. I should have it on my.
Kenneth, could I ask you a question? I'm fascinated by everything you've said. It's very, very stimulating, and you've engaged all the parts of my mind at once. But to try to bring it down to one question, and one specific question about a current need, by applying systemic thinking and recognizing all the way towards a holistic approach to everything, because that's what I understand is your personal commitment. The great crisis we have now, it seems to me, is both nature and man. And that is represented by two different mindsets, the East and the West, United States and China. And we clearly have a dilemma as to how we resolve what is increasingly spoken about, this negative atmosphere which is being created by all sorts of events and people. How does your approach to systemic thinking, how would you approach this dilemma to try to resolve it for a more harmonious outcome than seems to be apparent at the moment? What would your approach be?
Well, it's interesting. You know, I've been a practitioner of Aikido, which is a martial art for the last 35 years, and it's based on peace and harmony.
Incidentally, our last guest was an Aikido master, West Indo, basically. But
who was that?
Colin Reeve.
Oh, okay, great. Yeah.
Sorry
Wonderful.
to interrupt. Yeah.
No, I mean, in homeopathy, which I also practice, is also a very systemic way of looking at, you know, at life, and that's the framework. You know, conflict is it's not necessarily bad. You know, conflict is grist for creativity. You know, Michelangelo would carry his slab of marble up the hill, and people would make fun of him, and he would say, you know, there's a beautiful statue in here. And you know, humanity has a lot of commonalities. I think that once we started looking at things like quantum physics, we started realizing that we could have many, many different answers, and it could all be correct, depending on context. And that's where, you know, my rather long introduction, that's really what the essence of what I was saying, is that we have to look at things in context and simultaneously see things in a wider context, or what Gregory and even now Nora has articulated so well in what they call transcontextual looking, transcontext. So yes, East and West, when I originally studied anthropology, my field, I wanted to study and go to India, for years. And I had a wonderful scholarship and a nice stipend. And I had to learn Tamil, for three or 4 years. Everyone was like, you go there and learn Tamil, you go there and learn Hindi. And there was 30 of us. And, but what I learned most about South Asian philosophy is not only did I realize how homeopathy had such a strong foothold in India, but also that there are different ways of looking at the world, and there's no one person that can hold all the knowledge. So to go back to your question, John, is that the thing that seems to be evolving from people who are involved in systems thinking is to not only look at the complexity of the world. Complex means things are interwoven, and you can't break that complexity. It's here. So we are connected. Whether if they have poor leadership, as we have right now, in regard to the United States leadership, as regard to not really working collaboratively, we can't just be partners. Partners, there's too much at stake. It's like the chicken and the pig trying to do a ham and egg sandwich. They can have a great partnership, but the chicken says great, but the pig says, I don't know about that. But if they collaborate, they come up with a tofu tasting, almost ham and egg sandwich. We need more collaboration, and what we need is more mutual learning. And I think as systems start moving, as systems thinkers start really moving, what they're doing is starting to create dialogue, as you said before, Nika. And when we dialogue, we have to do collaboration. And we have to start small groups, and we have to be able to do transcontextual learning. Like, how is it that we in this one context could interrelate with another context, and so on and so on. And we might have to improvise. Life is messy, nature is messy. We will have paradoxes, we will have injurious interactions. What I learned, is from Aikido and possibly also studying, philosophy, is that the world, going back to conflict, is full of conflict. Look, in Buddhism, we have suffering, and yet there's a beautiful, beautiful, pattern of religion that could make things so much better. But go again, specifically, John, how do we deal with conflict? Well, we have to mitigate the inevitable injurious paradoxes by not only improvising, but looking for the possibilities. And part of that is, to be able to do it mutually. Nora Bateson coined the word somathesy, which is really mutual learning. How do we learn? And from there, you work and start looking at the different contexts. And from the context, you then start creating new possibilities, that are out there that could possibly change the world, whether it be economics, interdisciplinary. We can't have fragmentation anymore. So yes, with China, there are a lot of wonderful people in China who are thinking systemically. There's a lot of people who share things, whether it be through healing and stuff. So once we start really collaborating and having dialogue, I think that we are creating a world that is more congruent to nature. And that may sound so, wow, it's just gigantic, but where do we start? Gregory Bateson always said, and it always sticks with me, there's no individuality. He says it takes two to know one. And I think it takes many to know many. And that's part of that whole issue. So again, the dichotomy and polarizations of politics and whatnot, and greed and ego, these are falling towards disorder. It is an entropy that's happening. And maybe we need to start, working together, and demanding that we interrelate, collaborate, and stay away from, just the kind of cause and effect things that get in our way.
Yeah.
So may I therefore do, just, if I may, Anika, the follow-up question is, the other word you used, which rang a very, very big bell in the context of what we've just discussed. What part does forgiveness play in all this?
And why do we have to train people for forgiveness?
This is part of it. It's just several years ago, a friend of mine, Fred Luskin, who wrote a book, Forgive for Good, who's out in the West Coast teaching, asked me and a fellow clinician and a friend, Jed Rosen, to see if we could work together on, training people in forgiveness, and when I started recruiting people to, come to these trainings, a lot of things were like, why should I forgive? I don't want to deal with that no good, blah, blah, blah. But what I learned, again, systemically, is that forgiveness is not condoning or minimizing the past. We can't change the past. And in systems thinking, we learn from the past, but we can't change it. So the word is not the thing. The map is not the territory, as been said so many times. But sometimes, we need language just to kind of push us forward. But the definition of forgiveness is to minimize the ongoing conflict that we mentioned before, because we'll never totally get away from it, but we could mitigate, lessen the amount of injury. But being in the present, which is mindfulness. So, prerequisite for systems thinking is to be mindful. I mean, when you're mindful, you step outside of, the everyday dichotomies. Nature doesn't have dichotomies. We culturally impose that on people. So forgiveness is another sense of mindfulness. Maybe we could have called it mindfulness, but I think that mindfulness, when I first was doing my dissertation, I did it on double binds and, in different community organizations, how people would get stuck and the old would usurp the new. And I remember going down into the basement of the library at Columbia and asking if the computer person at that time was a gigantic computer, would give me some information on mindfulness, because I'd heard the word and studied Buddhism and South Asian philosophy. Well, there was like 5 or 6 citations. Now if you go on Google, there's 5 or 6 billion. And John Kabat then had about the same time, had the same experience. You couldn't find much. But
so can I come in here? Because
please.
Because I really like everything you're saying is music to my ears, because this is the kind of work I also do. So I call myself a process facilitator, which is very difficult for people to understand because, as you understand, the process, people don't get it. Not everybody, I'm saying, right? So we've been, for the past 6 years, I've been also working with my colleague. I don't know if you've heard of Professor Ronnie Lessum and Alexander Schiffer, Transform. Have you heard of that? So I'm part of that community. And they've spent, like Ronnie has spent 40 years on this integral consciousness and, integrating everything. And he talks exactly like you do. And I'm his student as well. So it's about the transdisciplinary. Would you say, I'm just picking from where I interrupted, you said that forgiveness now has, it's on Google, you can find many definitions and practices and all that. Would you say that our consciousness has now taken a leap, as in we do understand that, as you've written, a wider lens, the lens has to be wider, and our perspective has to be open to just have a wider view and see that it's not just on one problem or one issue.
Well, when we did, and that's a very good point, and I appreciate that. When we kind of developed a training for forgiveness, we really, not only stipulated, but encouraged people to not get stuck in the past. And also we talked about the nervous system. You have the parasympathetic, which is the and then you have the sympathetic, which is the fight or flight. And you have, the hypothalamus sense and something, the pituitary gland and the adrenal glands go crazy, but it's all automatic. And we get stuck there. And only recently have I really started studying the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is, in Latin, that's the word, the largest nerve of your nervous system. It goes through your whole body. How's this related? Well, it's the nerve of compassion. And when you are threatened, and again, remember, the nervous system is 95, 96% autonomic, it contracts, it glows. Dasher Keltner wrote a wonderful book. He's from Berkeley on Born to be Good. It's all about the vagus nerve and how now we're looking at, you've probably heard the polyvagal theory, things like that, that maybe a lot of the origins of autism, come from the vagus nerve being compromised and becoming, when there's insecurity, you become compromised. How does this relate to forgiveness? Well, a lot of times we have an event and it stays with us. It goes, again, being autonomic, it's hard to change your nervous system, and you're not supposed to save your life 24 hours a day if you're stuck in the sympathetic.
Sorry, my question is, would you say that the human consciousness has taken a leap now, that we can now integrate better? We can,
the new paradigms come about. Change comes about when we recognize anomalies. Remember Sir Thomas Kuhn, the scientific revolutions of change. Again, probably citing the title incorrectly, but everybody knows that. Everybody's cited that when they've done a dissertation. That when you recognize an anomaly, change comes about. So with the forgiveness training, really briefly, is that you stay in the present. You can't enforce unenforceable rules. And in the moment, through meditation, through mindfulness, this form of forgiveness is really mindfulness, and in a way that seemed to relate. It just resonated with people. The resistance was amazing. But again, sharing in small groups and being able to, not share with a million people, but share with people that are trusted, and then try to implement changes in your life that, again, don't necessarily adhere to the past, relieve your nervous system of the barriers and the weight of unresolved pain. So I always ask people when they come to me for therapies, especially families, I'll say, what is it? What is it that you want to see different? What's your core grievance? And all of a sudden, we could deal with something they're holding on to. And then we can move systemically through change and patterns of change, because in systems, there's patterns that connect. And once we start connecting things, a lot of times I'll have people to break the ice. I will, throw an object on the floor, and I have a lot of stories about different objects that I've thrown on the floor. And I'll say, I want everybody to give me 5 different perspectives on this object. And if you have 5 people in the room, you get 25, different views. And
that's more like the action learning technique you use as well. Yeah.
Right. We live together. I never knew that. And then you open up to get away from this, and you why. And so I usually tell people, let's make believe we have a camera and we're seeing a problem, and feel that problem. Taste it. And then I want you to widen your lens and look all around you, outside, inside, all over the place, and then come back. Never has anybody ever given me the same description of the original problem.
Yeah, it definitely works. I do that in my, action learning sets that I hold, and it works. There's always a shift,
So that's the forgiveness. The forgiveness model really, was to be able to stay in the present, to be mindful, can't change what you can't change, and at the same time, take care of yourself. And then when you interact, use what I call it more of a win-win volley, which is little things that we've learned years ago, paraphrasing, checking. These are collaboration. It's not competition. And sports could be competitive, but when we're talking about conflict, we're talking about, how do we mitigate the unenviable urge for the world to impose paradoxes on us, and how do we avoid those double binds, and how do we work together collaboratively? So it is a mindful process, and sometimes words get in the way, but it seems to work. And homeopathy, without getting into it, homeopathy is poo-pooed a whole lot. Maybe I should get into it. It works. There's a lot of research. It's kept out of the mainstream. And here in the United States, I found out, being a psychologist, that almost all your psychiatric hospitals were homeopathic, and had wonderful success because it is a very holistic. Hahnemann, who founded it, was a systems thinker. He looked at the whole picture, and then he looked at these remedies and was constantly looking at a way to get away from the more allopathic, injurious medication that this maintains, and to be able to cure really individually. So there's so many different remedies, and it's a wonderful art. And unfortunately, under a lot of attack in the United States by entrepreneurs and corporations at this
Would
point.
you say the world is now ready for any alternative healing? I don't think so.
It's funny.
All I hear is scientific. Everything has to be scientifically
I mean, not only in India, but in 1918, 1919, during the flu epidemic at that time, homeopathy was very big in the United States. 1 out of 3 doctors were homeopaths. There was 40 homeopathic hospitals in New York, 20 in New Jersey, and their death rate was something like 5 or 10%. They treated everybody individually, and they treated people with homeopathy, whereas the mortality rate in the traditional hospitals was 85%. Right now, I have colleagues that are in Africa and in India and who are working using the homeopathic remedies that were used, way back when, and are having success, but it's suppressed. So part of systems thinking is, again, how do we get to open that wider lens and to start integrating, things and getting away from, corporate-driven solutions that are not working. Look what happened now. I mean, not only are we seeing such fragmentation in our institutions in the West, but we're also seeing, dealing with the pandemic, especially here in the United States, in such a way of isolation and divide and conquer. These are the results. So maybe again, through falling to some kind of disorder as entropy, as the law of entropy, that new order. Ilya Prigogine always said that, once you go down and, there's pieces of the old that'll come up with the new. Well, homeopathy is not new, neither is forgiveness. We go back and, Native Americans in the United States to indigenous societies and cultures always had a closer connection to nature. And again, you go back to Gregory's, the initial quote that I mentioned, that problems in the world are different.
It's exactly what we've been discussing, and Mark and I always say, it's like people forget, we forget, humans forget, it's nothing new, we are actually going back to the basic because there's no other way, right? But we forget. And I think, and that would be my question, maybe, I don't know if you agree that we would still need those people who are facilitating the process, who are, I keep on telling John as well, the impulses. Who is that person? There has to be those facilitators, the catalysts, the stewards who can steward this shift, this change.
There is a shift going on, and I mentioned Nora Bateson, who I have utmost respect for, and is probably one of the more rigorous thinkers. She is the president of the International Bateson Institute, and has written a lot about what she calls warm data. And this process is training, not only training, but allowing people to meet in small groups and move into what we call transcontextual learning. And you could see how many different people now are starting to not only understand this language. I mean, I teach at the graduate level. I do some lecturing at the New York Medical College, which used to be a homeopathic college years ago. Maybe, hopefully, they're coming back to their roots, and at a few of the universities. And I'm working with people who are becoming family therapists. And the basis of family therapy is systems thinking. And yet, when I ask them, well, what is your epistemology and what is systems? They're looking with blank eyes. So maybe what's happening now, the injurious patterns that are occurring are almost maybe allowing us to look at things more systemically, because that's what nature is about.
Definitely.
And as we do solutions, solutions are coming from, how to open up our buildings and stuff. We're not getting a whole lot of guidance from the powers to be. People are working together. How do we do this? How do we collaborate? How do we not just be partners? How do we actually come up with a wider level that allows us all to have the vested interests and positive results?
John?
Any questions at this time?
A few. Why and who is attacking homeopathy? Is it purely commercial interests?
That's a good question, John. And I know that that there is a lot of commercial interest because I know that a lot of funding is done from pharmaceutical companies. But there's also a paradigm that people don't want to let go of. You know, I mean, you know, a lot of the people who attack are usually affiliated with a lot of different anti-change movements. And it's also a lot of control. You know, they'll cite and say, well, you know, if something's dissolved more than 30 times, you know, there's a law, and therefore it doesn't exist. But then we know with water research, and we know with a lot of the research that's happening throughout, mostly in Germany, where you still have to be you study homeopathy to be an MD, and obviously in India and a lot of other countries where there's a different economic structure. You're seeing, you know, holding on to the past, not looking, you know, looking at things very myopically, not even allowing a discussion. I've had some discussions with people who are, one person in Canada who was a leading an advocate against homeopathy, and started out with a nice conversation, and I said, why don't you give me a few things to read, and I'll give you a few things to read. And I gave him some really good, you know, things like The Biology of Belief by Lipton, and various things that really look at, you know, the possibilities of like nano research and, you know, stuff that really makes sense. And he basically sent me some very, very disparaging, non-research-based literature that was almost fairly aggressive and embarrassing. And when I said, oh, you know, why did you read what I sent you? He goes, I don't read that pseudo stuff. But it turns out that this fellow is, you know, being funded by you know, certain corporations that deal with insecticides and pesticide spraying, and you know, so you look at the, you know, you do an autopsy or a profile, a living autopsy of these people. They seem to be, you know, not rigorous and not listening. There's no listening skills. I mean, there's no competition. In certain places where homeopathy is accepted, there's a dialogue, and when you have a dialogue, like in France. Something like, I don't know exact figure, but I think it's more than 50% of traditional physicians use homeopathy collaboratively or complementary in many ways. And it seems to work. You know, I mean, I could tell you from the people I worked with. I got into homeopathy, you know, years ago, working with youngsters who had Crohn's disease and different autoimmune issues. And homeopathy is probably one of the only modalities that actually resolves those issues. Whereas in traditional medicine, allopathic medicine, you have surgery, you have toxic medication. One medication leads to another and another and another. So when I work with families, I don't push homeopathy. They usually ask me, or people who've come from Germany or India will say, I don't want to take this kind of medication for depression. And the interesting thing is I probably get more referrals from psychiatrists for their family members because they don't want their family members to be taking what they prescribe to other people. So it's
very good. There's one more thing I'd like to ask you. This is a personal, my own way of seeing things. My personal relationship with nature is very personal. But my experience of nature is that nature is very aware of my presence, as I am very aware of nature's presence. I have a strong intuitive feeling that what we're going through is nature's response to our historical record as human beings, and it's nature is driving us into our current psychological frame of mind as a result of its reaction to our activities. Would you regard this as lunacy, or do you think there's some validity to what I've said?
No. Sorry.
You know him better than I do, but I'm getting to know him. And that's, John, that's very, very profound. And I'm very much in agreement with that. Because nature is a system that, when you say don't mess with Mother Nature, the more we do mess, there's, systems do adjust. They do try to, in many ways, adapt and to create new patterns. And I think, we as a species have gotten to the point not only with, how we deal with our climate, or how we have self-serving politicians who will not even adhere to considering, anything systemic because of their own greed and ego. Yes, nature is acting in a way that is only that it has to in many ways. We're only recently understanding how, I'm looking out my window here, and there's how trees are interconnected, through a root system, how things like forest bathing actually help humans. I think nature is not trying to kill us off. I think it's trying to say, you know what, we could work collaboratively, and you're going to have to listen. Interesting, where I'm living is about 20 miles north of New York City, in a cute little town called Nyack, New York. And there's a large bridge that we used to call it Tapmazee Bridge, and they just built a new one. And it's probably one of the most has most densely traffic use in probably the whole country. And during the pandemic, with people staying home and not many people driving, the pollution rate has gone down immensely. It's like you could see, and you can see the clarity. Los Angeles is another example. So, I mean, there is an adjustment. Do we take advantage of this? Do we say, well, how could we really start doing that? Or should we keep on, doing away with regulations because they're not, creating an economic boost, when in fact, there are many different ways to increase our economic productivity with alternative forms of energy, et cetera. So yes, I think that nature is really giving us a clear warning, just kind of saying, you know what, if you don't really start mitigating, how you're messing around with things, it's going to get worse. And there's no intent. It's just systemically, it almost has to happen to be able to, maintain itself, because there's a homeostatic, quality to all systems, including nature. And so you could have a dysfunctional system too. I mean, if I take my clock here on the wall, and which has about 100 different parts, and I bend one, it'll still work and maybe till a 28-hour day. It's not going to help us.
Thank you very much. But before we,
thank you.
Yes, before we go away, just any practical tip you would like to give to our viewers and to ourselves as well.
Well, one of the things that's a good question too. I mean, when I work with people, not only with people who come for therapy, but my own family. I have 3 wonderful adult children, and my sweetheart was an artist. We try to stay in touch with, a lot of friends and colleagues, and work together. I basically say to people, is to keep a wider perspective. Try as much as possible, look at things, from a different, vantage point. And second of all, is to create supportive environments. Context is a wonderful thing. Content, no. Yes, we need it sometimes, but context is what it's all about. So keep a good environment, keep a good context that supports your systemic thinking. And thirdly, I would say, celebrate possibilities. Aestheticism is the human metaphor, for nature. So do poetry. I write poetry. If you go on my website, I do a lot. I'm from Paterson, New Jersey, where you have wonderful poets like William Carlos Williams and Maria Gillian Mazzotti and Allen Ginsberg. People that I knew, and I didn't know William Williams because he was much older. But their legacy carries on. Artwork and things like that, inspiration. And lastly, I would say be fallible. Make your adjustments. We're not perfect. So I think that for practical advice, I think that's what I would say. Be systemic, be supportive in your environment, celebrate art and possibilities, and be fallible, and recognize your fallibility, make adjustments. And as I think, as Gandhi once said, your views become your thoughts become your actions, I believe, become your destiny. I think that's pretty good advice.
Thank you so much for your advice and your time. Stay well.
Thank you, Kenneth.
Pleasure meeting both of you, and I hope to continue our conversations on another level, because I'm very impressed with your questions. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Bye-bye.